We're going to have this panel discussion right now, and our guests for the discussion are Francis Lynch, Executive of Ruah and President of ACOS, Mark Fitzpatrick, Chief Executive Officer with the St Vincent de Paul Society of Western Australia, and Neil Hamilton, CEO of AccordWest. Even before they've opened their mouths, please give them encouragement. Could I also just remind you, I know that when we raced out to grab a cuppa and a croissant, that many of you might have turned on your phones to, could I just ask you just to check that they're on silent too, as a courtesy to our speakers. So what we're going to do first, before we begin the panel discussion per se, is just get each to talk a little bit about where their organisation comes from. What is it that their organisation is doing, is fighting, and stands for? And I think we'll start with Francis Lynch, Executive of Ruah and, of course, ACOS.
Thank you, Verity. We were just talking up here on the panel earlier. There's a little container full of chocolates. And we were thinking if there was a good question later, I know that you were saying there may not be questions, but you know, we'll throw out the chocolates to anyone who's got a good question.
Cute.
Ruah is an organisation that's been around for about 55 years. We've been working in Perth, and our origins are in homelessness. And I think the history of Ruah is an example of how things have changed over the years. So Ruah started with a group of Catholic religious daughters of charity going around and walking around the streets of Northbridge in the inner city and finding people who were homeless and providing them food and trying to find shelter. They also found a place on Aberdeen Street. So originally they were on Fitzgerald Street, and they also found a place in Aberdeen Street and provided a place for women escaping domestic violence to live. So this was back in the 50s. And the way that Ruah does homelessness services and works with people who are homeless now has some origins which are still really linked to that, but are also very different. And I think the way that we think about working and supporting people who are homeless, I think, has really changed over that time. We still have a service in Northbridge, the Ruah Centre, and provide services for people to be able to drop in, to be able to get something to eat and drink, have a shower, get some change of clothes, connect with services. Unfortunately, it's closed right at the moment because we had a fire 2 weeks ago. So someone lit a fire at the back of the premises, and 2 weeks later, or a week and a half later, we're still not open again. But hopefully we will be next week. And we know that as part of what happens for people who are rough sleeping in Perth, they really miss not being able to come in and use the services that are there, and to be able to connect with the other providers who come in and work from that location. We're also still running to women's refuges, so which are quite close to the city. So there's as one of the stats on the Chukwa presentation, 34%, as you said there, of people who are homeless have got a connection through domestic violence, and we certainly know and understand that a lot. One of the other things that Ruah does is we do a lot of mental health work. It's actually become a larger part of what we do than the homelessness work, but that came out of our experience of working with people who are homeless. So 20 years ago, there was a recognition from the staff that the vast majority of people who we were working with who were homeless also had a mental illness. And so we started to find ways to actually do that. I was just in a discussion with our board and executive last night where we were looking at all of the people that we are connected to and how we do our work, both whether they're women leaving prison, whether it's people living with mental illness, whether it's people who are homeless or in our domestic violence services. The one connecting theme through everything that we are doing as an organisation is housing. And the lack of access to housing is just the major theme that goes through everything that our organisation does. That's one of the things I was really, really pleased to hear the Chief Justice talk about what he was saying, or to hear what he was saying, and to hear that he recognises that, and he recognises the strong need for support services, social support services for people as a prevention for people going into prison, because as we know, that's a really expensive way to house someone. You know, there are better ways of doing this, and, you know, part of the theme of this session really is to understand, you know, what are the costs of housing people, or not housing people, to the costs of allowing people to remain homeless. And it's just tragic. I mean, the personal costs are tragic, but the economic costs across society, we're choosing to accept higher costs by allowing things to stay the way they are. And you know, every chance I get when I'm speaking with other people in the community, whether I'm speaking with ministers or people within government departments, I try and make that plain, is that we're choosing this. We're actually making an active choice as a community to do things the way we're doing it. One of the things I think that is also, I'm hearing at different times people say that the homelessness sector, the services, we need to collaborate better and we need to get things sorted on our side. And I agree. I think there is actually a lot we need to do better.
So let's come back to that issue, because I'm sure that it's all of our panel members are going to talk about that, except that you've got one little...
I was just going to say, but I think there's actually been a huge shift in my personal experience over the last 6-7 years, is we're actually doing a lot better than we were. And there's a lot of things that I think that there is actually great collaboration happening. I'm not saying there shouldn't be better, but there actually is quite a lot.
And that's wonderful that the people in the industry are being so much more collaborative, but I wonder about the government when I looked at that restricted eligibility for housing, and you think, you know, at one level, fantastic, but at that level, that's the area that needs so much more work. Let's hear from our next speaker now, Mark Fitzpatrick. Tell us all about St Vincent de Paul. Well, not all about, actually, just a little bit. You do a lot of things, just a little bit.
I think Francis took a lot of time, and I've got about 30 seconds to give you a bit of a rundown. Sorry. Next year, Vinnie's is going to be in WA for 150 years. We were established over here in 1865, and indeed we're in 149 countries around the world. The core of what we do is to go and service the poor where they are, in their own homes. Good. And so we've got about 3,000 members and volunteers and only about 135 staff across Western Australia. And we service communities as far north as Halls Creek, out to Callan, down to Albany. So geographically, we're probably the largest spread charity around, probably other than the Red Cross. We're a unique charity. We get less than 10% of our funding from government. All the rest is self-generated through our stores, through our donations, and through some of the services we provide in the community. In terms of the homelessness side of things, our aim is really to try and stop it. If you stop the demand, then you, as Francis said, you can actually put more money into that side of things. Prevention is better than the cure. So what we do is we actually get a lot of people coming to see us about the costs of living, and obviously housing is the major part of that. And then that often then works its way into, I don't put food on the table at night. I can't clothe my kids don't go to school. So we see that very pointy end, but we're in a very privileged position, I suppose, to be invited into people's homes to help them. So if we can get in that and do that early, my utopia is not to be in existence in 150 years. So we've solved the problem. I don't like my chances. I wish I did. In terms of the specific homeless services that we provide, in addition to that home visitation model, we've had a long partnership with the Rotary Club of Perth. Most of you would be aware of the Passages program that's based in Northbridge. We've been running that as a collaboration with them for the last 15 years and serviced over 15,000 different individuals just through Northbridge, and we've opened a new one a couple of years back in Mandurah, given the high youth unemployment and other social issues in the Peel region. We've just opened Tom Fisher House, and I see the manager for that service, Rebecca's in the crowd today. So that's looking at the acute end. We're having a look at that from a slightly different perspective, and hopefully we can start to establish a very good take on a medical respite model for homelessness, so we can have a look at the ED costs associated with actually providing services for that acute area and reduce some of those costs to government and have that translated hopefully into some funding that we get. We obviously do some housing, but one of the things that we do, which is not dissimilar to what Francis talked about, given that the high prevalence of mental health issues with the homeless, is we actually have a 3-tier mental health program. So we have a 24/7 care crisis, or quite intensive for those with persistent severe mental illness, and there's a high number of those people who in that program have been homeless. And then we have step downs in terms of different levels of supervision into the community. So we try and actually have a look at it from a preventative point of view, and that's where we want to put most of our efforts, but then also try and have a look at the issue around homelessness from a service delivery perspective. For us moving forward, I'll make no bones about the fact that we're looking at getting into housing more. It's the single biggest cause of why people come to us on a daily basis in terms of that cost. So if we can actually increase supply in some way, then we can do that. And the good thing about Vinnie's, we're a big charity, we've got a great brand and great relationship, so hopefully we can leverage off that and provide proof of concepts about different models which then everyone can leverage from. If we didn't have to do it, we wouldn't be in it, to be perfectly blunt. And so we're looking at that sort of area. And the other one is having a look at how we can use social impact financing. And unfortunately, the issue of homelessness in WA is one that it goes across so many different government agencies that it's going to make it really hard in this space to have a look at it, but we're going to keep trying. The concern for me at the moment is that the low income levels that people have to step out of housing, particularly in the public system or even in the community system, that tier that sits above that, they're 1 or 2 pay packets away from being homeless. And they seem to be the forgotten people about all the whole conversation that we have around this. So they're forced out of a system which doesn't work for them. We're not actually keeping kids in the same home, going to the same school, so we're at risk of creating intergenerational issues. And for me, that's a big concern that we need to start to tackle.
Huge, huge. Neil Hamilton.
Thank you, Verity. I'm with AccordWest. AccordWest, some may have known as Agencies for Southwest Accommodation Incorporated. That was based out of Bunbury. We're a relatively small organisation in one sense, and yet an organisation that in the last year saw more than 15,000 people choose one of our services. I'm not sure that's a figure you want to be proud of, but it's a pragmatic reality of what we're dealing with, what each one of you are dealing with out there. And when we start looking at how it comes home to us, in our Bunbury office alone, 15 families will present in any 1 week who are homeless. We don't have homelessness like walking down here this morning. You know, I walked past 3 or 4 homeless people. You don't see that in Bunbury, but it's equally as prevalent, but we tend to see it in families. What impacts for us is that if we look at the families, we have 3 housing options a week. So you have to do some kind of triaging and say to 12 families, there is no option that we can help you with. There are no exit options. We've seen things, and I'll be curious to hear back from people, we've seen things like caravan parks, low-impact motels requiring people to present with a police clearance. So you can imagine when we start talking about homelessness and highly vulnerable people, the chances of getting... So what we're seeing is a shrinking opportunity to transition people successfully. AccordWest also works in the prison reintegration, and again, it's an interesting enigma. We'll see people legitimately eligible for parole. I'm going to put in parentheses, we're not talking about people who are sex offenders, or we're not talking about people who are at risk of doing significant damage from violent crime. We're talking people who are legitimately eligible for parole, and yet they may have a $5,000 debt with our public housing and therefore are not able to be exited. That means they'll stay in prison for another 12 to 18 months. Now that's $180,000 to $250,000 that the state will bear for that decision. So when we start talking about we can't afford homelessness, there's got to be a great reason. The other area that we work in, and we have 33 different funded programs, is we work with children who've been apprehended by the state, not because the children are bad, because of the familial system that they've come to have been subject to abuse. And when you look back into that, the lack of stable housing is one of the significant issues. So there are many faces, but one thing that AccordWest prides itself on is that stable, safe accommodation is a high priority to reduce the impact on some of these people.
And there are so many aspects of conversation even beyond then too. The extra year that that person is going to spend in prison for a relatively small amount means that that's another year not socialised into a community, which means another 10 years to get socialised, and on it goes, that terrible cycle.
And look, Verity, I heard a marvellous conversation. I was in Singapore last week at the reintegration conference, and certainly coming out of the Canadian prison service, the Deputy Commissioner there was talking about, we understand when people shift to another culture, we understand the difficulty of moving into a new culture and how do you assimilate. And yet there's nothing different to someone coming out of prison. They have been in a different culture and they need to re-assimilate back into community. And I just found it was an interesting vignette to start looking, and I think as I thought about it, that applies to so much of what we do around homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. Comments from our Lord Mayor, Lisa Scafidi, saying that nobody needs to beg in Australia. We have the best social welfare system in the world. I wonder how you feel about that is the open question. I think I know how we really feel about it. I wonder how damaging you think that sort of thing is in terms of focusing mainstream people who are not involved with homelessness. Thank you, Mark.
Without being disparaging to Lisa, and Lisa's a great supporter of ours, I think it's a little naive, the comment. But in terms of, I think let's focus on what the people on the street actually say. And one of the things that happened at the CoSleep out a couple of years ago, we had a young bloke who would have been about 19, and he was speaking in front of all the CEOs, and he says, if you see us on the street, don't give us money. Buy us a cup of coffee or buy us a meal and listen to the story we have to tell. Because often the story can tell you the context, and I think the context of how an individual is where they are helps them get out of where they are. And that was a really important insight for so many people who participated in that event to take away. So I think that there's a vast majority of people who won't and don't do it because of any other thing for a need. But if we focus on the begging as opposed to what's causing it, I think we're focusing on the wrong thing. It's really simple.
Well, as Jim's stories proved it earlier, you know, go and talk, and then you find that man who's been lost to his family for 52 years, who was one of the brightest people around. I mean, we all know people, don't we, who've taken, you know, some people can have dope every day and it's perfectly fine for them. Other people have psychotic episodes. I know a number of young people who've had psychotic episodes, life gone. That's it. Their chances at all of their joys, their future, their goals, their dreams, gone.
One of the things that we find in passages, if I can just quickly say, when a young person comes in and for the first time and we actually work with them, a key part of it is that they've got no postal address and they've got no proof of identification, and then we work with them to try and actually get them access to some of the basics that other people take for granted, such as being on Centrelink while we work with them to get ready to go back into employment or into education or back with their families, or be able to secure some sort of tenancy. So there's a few steps that often happen prior to that, and it's through services like ours and Ruah's and others that can provide that support, but we only capture a certain amount of those people. And to be realistic about it, we don't capture all of them.
I think one of the things is to reflect on what Jim said about complexity, is that a lot of the people that we're talking about, people who are homeless and people who may be begging, you know, there is an individual story for each person. Some of the people in the room I know participated in the registry week in May this year, where we went out and actually spoke individually with people who are rough sleeping in the CBD. We also did that in 2012. So, you know, what we know from those interviews when we've done the vulnerability index, when you actually start to talk to people on an individual basis and get to know them on an individual basis, and that as service providers, that's what I think we've got the opportunity to do, and to collaborate better and to work better. Then, you know, I think the sort of political response to a situation like begging, and begging does appear to have increased over the last few years. There's no doubt about that. But having a police response or a move-on response is not actually the answer. And I think
it doesn't fix it. It just moves it. I don't know why anybody thinks it does.
And as Jim said, you know, often it is about a long-term relationship building exercise and being able to understand what's going on. One of the other things I'm involved in is the Big Issue in Perth, and you know, so Jim Petrie, who manages the Big Issue, you know, he will go around and talk with people, and I know he's approached a lot of the people who beg, and you know, it's again not a straightforward thing, because you know that from an economic rationalist point of view, you might say, well, rather than begging, why don't you sell the Big Issue? But you know, that's not necessarily the solution. And most of the people he talks to, they don't all of a sudden become Big Issue vendors either. So you know, there's a complexity and an understanding of who we are as people, and how do we actually get to know somebody and understand what's actually going to make a difference.
If all three of you have said that getting people into a stable environment that has some sort of longevity is vitally important for their children, for them, for getting treatment, for all sorts of reasons. Is there one single factor that you can say, this is the most important thing we should be focusing on to get that for those people who are homeless?
Look, I don't think there's one thing, but again, as I noted at the outset, the kind of people that would present to us are not the stereotypical homeless. But it's interesting when we juxtapose those children who are coming into care and the families that are at risk, or with our re-entry programs, that if people start moving and are moved around because of the lack of affordable accommodation, the children start to have disruptive schooling. They start to not build the networks through sport, through peer groups, and that's where we see that fragmentation start. So while for me there's no one simple solution, but just trying to keep people in an area of support is important. And we see that again as another group that we see overrepresented is children who've been in care, and yet they will go from one care location, it might be sitting and they might be going to a school, then they will go to the other end of the city, and so that cohesion starts to evaporate. And so bringing cohesion back in, bringing community connection, both in service provision, but bringing the community into the dialogue seems to be a fundamental.
I'm really impressed by what Chief Justice Martin said this morning. I mean, there were a number of things, and I saw an ABC camera, and I hope they really put some stuff on TV tonight from what he said, because, you know, one of the things he said, which I so agree with, is a lot of what we've done in the past to address homelessness hasn't worked. You know, we've got to come up with some better ways of doing this, and, you know, the investment in social programs rather than prisons and police. There is evidence-based approaches to working with people who are homeless, but the funders in Australia have continued to not support those services in the way that I think they should. So an example of that is a program like Housing First. So, you know, actually saying we don't need to take somebody who is rough sleeping, and I know I'm focusing on rough sleeping a little bit too much probably, but you know, we don't need to put them into a shelter and then into a group, you know, accommodation for the next 3 or 6 months, and then into another place which is group living for the next 6 months. When actually, if you spoke to those people and understood their needs, you'd know that a group setting is never going to work. And then in fact, we should be providing accommodation directly for that person, straight up, and giving them the support they need to become successful. You know, the economics of this is overwhelmingly on the side of a program like Housing First. You know, some of the most conservative states in the US, Utah and others, actually see this and will actually provide the housing for no rent even for the first year or two, because they know that in the long term, as a government, they will actually save money.
I've actually got some big concerns in terms of what Neil said about, particularly around families, and I think I was at a conference a couple of years back where I think the stat was 50% of those who are homeless had parents who are homeless at some point in their lives. And I've got 2 young kids, and imagining them being homeless at any particular point and what impact that would have, it sets up, again, another generation. So investment now, and there's a couple of great programs in other states which we could replicate. We're not talking about reinventing the wheel, we're just actually saying, how do we invest to actually create some longevity? And so there's a family back on track program on the Gold Coast, for example, that looks at particularly single parent families who are homeless sleeping in cars. There's a whole range of stuff that's out there. And I think we've just got to tackle some of this and some of the design stuff, some of the funding side of this. And if you're looking at youth issues, particularly around and the outcome that we get with homelessness, if you predate that and have a look at where you're going to get the funds to actually develop a proper program, you're looking at 5 or 6 government agencies and all the silos that go with it. It's absolute rubbish. And then the government agencies develop programs in good intent, but really the design stuff is actually, I think, inhibiting some innovative thinking around that. So we need to go back to some of the basics and have a look at how we can actually construct an outcome, because homelessness is a complex issue. It's not just a housing issue, or it's not just an employment issue. It's actually quite often a multifaceted issue, and it varies between different parts of the country and indeed the state. I was talking to my counterpart in the Northern Territory. 40% of the people who go to Vinnies in the Northern Territory are employed, whereas 96% in WA are on some sort of government benefit.
Why then do they go there if they're employed?
Because the cost of rent.
As is
So-
here, but mind you, our cost of rent is also just astronomical.
Yeah. Our cost of rent has gone up significantly, and we're actually in a position, as we heard this morning, in terms of all the issues around housing supply. It's a significant one for us. But in some parts of the state, let alone some parts of the country, that is exacerbated for different reasons in different areas. And I think we need to have a look at key issues. And Dale Alcott was speaking this morning. We've got to have a look at how we can construct and increase supply quickly. The fact of the matter is, in Victoria, you can get building approval, and in 24 hours you can start building. In WA, it's ridiculous. And there's 30 different local government authorities, all of which with different crossover requirements and different setback requirements. And when we're trying to construct homes, in which we have to increase supply, you've got to have a look at all these other inbuilt factors about how we can actually inhibit what we're actually trying to do from a social good, let alone anything else.
That's bullshit. I mean, that is just, isn't it? That is just absolutely crazy. And even when I think about my own, I'm very happy about my city, Vincent, but I mean, you know, they only meet every 2 weeks, so you're not going to get a response for anywhere near 24 hours for anything like that. And a friend of mine, one of those, I don't know who was at the launch on Monday, but Sue talked about the two new groups which are emerging, which are families and women over 60 who have nothing. And I had a friend who arrived on Monday. She's in shared accommodation with people she doesn't know. She's turning 60 on Friday. She has no superannuation. She's in a job that's a very low-paid job. And I look at this woman who's in my social group and I think, how did that happen? And I know when she was going for rental accommodation, I went with her, 70 people turned up, all of whom were earning a whole lot more than she was for this particular house. They all wanted that house just as much. There's no way in the world that the landlord was going to look at her and go, oh yes, you're my ideal tenant, I think I'll take you in. And you just think, where do you go? Where are we?
There's also been some really great programs to stop the issue at the start and in Victoria, for example, I think it's the social services, whatever the government department is over there, they had a look at developing, I think they had 22 different programs they funded, and they said, we want something different, it's not working. And they cut that back to 11. And one program is actually working with the Real Estate Institute Victoria, and then working with them and real estate agents to actually have a look at right-sizing homes, house swapping, a whole range of different things to actually prevent homelessness for families particularly. And so there's some programs that are out there that we can replicate quite easily, and it's not a big cost. Even if government funds it, it's not a big cost compared to what the cost is at the outcome. So there's a lot of stuff that we need to do to have a look at the prevention as much as having a look at what happens when people become primary, secondary or tertiary homeless.
So who can instigate that?
Well, we keep trying it all the time in terms of the conversations that we have with all forms of government. But I'm not sure in terms of where we sit at the moment. If I had a magic wand, I'd wave it, but I don't.
I think there's just lots of innovative ideas. I think we just need to keep trying. Again, one of the things Jim said was, he's failed a lot of times as well as succeeded. So, and I think we all need to take that risk. I mean, I'm very impressed by an organisation in Melbourne, Homeground, which has taken on the opportunity of running a not-for-profit real estate agency. So, they are a community housing provider. They knew that they had a lot of skills in managing tenants. They've actually gone out to the private rental market and said to owners of properties, how about you put your property with us? And they've only been running for about 5 or 6 months now, and they've got over 100 properties that they're managing, quite a number. So about a third of those properties are just being rented at market rates, but about another 30 or 40% of those properties are actually being rented at below market rates. So the owner has actually said, look, we really buy into what you're trying to do, and we will actually provide our property at below market rates. And that's actually a win-win, because the provider, the organisation Homeground, is actually managing, as any other property manager does, to actually take the fees and to run their business, but also they're delivering some properties that are actually on that lower market rate. And in fact, what surprised them entirely is that there's a whole group of property owners who, and I was talking with Heather Holst, who runs the organisation, quite recently, and she was saying, there's a number of property owners who actually didn't have their house in market at all. So they owned a property, wasn't being used, and in some cases they've actually bought the property to Homeground and said, look, you can rent it out. We don't want the rent, we don't need it, but you can rent it out and make it available. And in fact, the rent that's coming in from those properties is being used to cross-subsidise the program and do all the rest of it. I mean, she's blown away by, if you take a risk and do something different, that in fact, things might actually start to change. So.
Can I just build on what's being said there? I think it was interesting. I'd love to have owned the idea, but it was actually a very young guy who was seconded temporarily into town planning in the city of Busselton. And we're sitting around talking about the lack of availability, and he just said, Neil, do you realise how much unused accommodation there is in this region? And it was 15 to 20% of unused accommodation. When we started looking more closely, the town planning schemes actually did not support the use of that accommodation, which is interesting because in Queensland they've developed the Fonzie law. And for those of you who got the white bearded hair, or mightn't have the white beard but got the hair like me, may remember Fonzie, who lived above the garage with the Cunninghams, and he used that. And one of the things that, if we can help or get, and there is phenomenal goodwill out there, I've seen it in something we've done just quite recently, is to engage that and to try and release other forms of accommodation which are not necessarily going to be a major expense on the state, but we need local government to come on board with the conversation.
Yeah, most definitely. I was just thinking of Julian Burnside too, an extraordinary human rights activist and lawyer who put his money where his mouth is, and he rents out a room in his very flash home to refugees. For short-term periods, that person goes out and then the next person comes in. I just go, thank you, God, for people like that. So we're at the end of our time here with the panel discussion, even though I know that you've all got so much more to say and so much more to add. Can I urge everybody here to either write down the thoughts that you've got going around in your head right now, because we're going to break you into groups from about 11:30, where we want you to come up with those ideas that you think will work too. We want practical ideas, examples of what we can do to assist the situation here. For the moment though, will you please thank our wonderful panellists here and their organisations, Francis Lynch, Mark Fitzpatrick and Neil Hamilton,